Welcome to First Thursday in March. We will take a look at the chapter on a chapter in the book on giving my word that goes by the name Fragments of a Personal Narrative. The fragments are stories that I tell myself in an attempt to lay hold of the elusive narrative of who I am. They occur in my faith life, my pastoral life, my love life, garden life, and in my tentative grasp of my own dying. There is no intent to give them any kind of preferred status. If they amaze or amuse you, well and good. But what I am seeking is that they enable you to engage in your own story, which is good for you, but is also necessary for me. I try to make this claim clear in an aphorism numbered 15 on page 35 of the book. There I write, it is important that the telling of these stories present themselves as an invitation to others to tell their story. No story is complete in itself. Each story requires the stories of others to complete it. It is from the body of stories that the great narrative takes off. Before we look at the content of this chapter, we would do well to consider where this storytelling begins. This has been taken up in an opening chapter of the book whose title is Origins of Narrative. The answer that this chapter provides is that narratives begin in the divine life, in the Trinity. The begotten Son is the word that goes forth. In every human being, the word calls. And the response to that call constitutes consciousness, initially and continually renewed with the memory that yields the base story we tell ourselves, I am. Narrative is henceforth cosmological and personal. Narrative is a really big idea that governs the whole course of this book, its major theme. And that said, however, let's back off and enjoy whatever note a fragment might sound for you. I would like to begin with a story relevant to my faith life. It can be found on page 41 in the poem entitled An Ode to a Little Church. The little church is in one sense Trinity Episcopal Church, Carroll, Iowa, where I grew up. In another sense, it is the Episcopal Church in general to which I continue to belong. The opening slide of this video is a recent picture of that little church, and it's probably never looked better. There are several sections to this poem, but I'll be reading only its opening, Finding God. It is oddly personal, and yet relevant, I think, to any seeker trying to understand their own spiritual journey. An Ode to a Little Church, Part 1, Finding God. When I found you, it was in a little wooden church, carpenter Gothic, as they say, not without a touch of irony, built on the crest of the 19th century's optimism, 1885 to be exact, only to be shuttered during the froth that followed, when optimism soured and then broke in the next century. And then unshuttered by a wave of post-war enthusiasm, 1952 to be exact. This reopening coincides with a strange set of family circumstances that brought me to the catechetical efforts of the newly ordained priest, the Reverend Charles Bradshaw, the sincere, if clumsy, scion of a prominent family of Des Moines, the capital city of our state, well placed among its lawyers and bankers. This and the presence in the congregation of a district judge provided my father, who, in spite of all of his religious inclinations, he was, after all, the son of an anti-clerical father and a pious Catholic mother, a common pattern in Italian immigrants, to consent after 12 years of marriage, to his wife and his children attending this little church. My mother, for whom this little church was equally strange, found in its strangeness a kind of self-assertion. Amid her general pattern of acquisition, how clearly I see her at confirmation, which followed the season of catechism, receiving the same laying on of hands as I, regal I would say. It was only later when my college classmate visiting our home remarked to my surprise that she was beautiful, which I, for the first time in my life, so saw. In the summer of 1956, I, with my younger brothers, painted the little church, then reopened for a total of 4 years, but still looking shuttered. It followed the summer before when we had begun mowing the churchyard, my father ashamed of uncut grass, and doubly motivated by his vision of his own WPA, by which he could keep his kids engaged in manual labor, good he was sure for ensuring our manhood. Up to then, our painting expertise was constrained to the endless repainting of the wooden fence that surrounds our house. How we managed to move that wooden extension ladder, secure but weighty, I cannot imagine. Nor in the end what sort of result we managed to achieve beyond the whiteness running down from the eave. In my father's eyes, this made the little church littler. In mine, I almost said grand. But the truth is, I could never see it without looking through my father's eyes. And so I would say, to my hands, it made the little church feel more concrete, and the encounter with the clumsy catechetic and with its odd collection of humanity more real. Indeed, at the time, I remember thinking that its very woundedness made it possible for me to put my hand into its side, and with that I could cry out with Thomas, my Lord and my God. Well, I warned you that it'd be oddly personal. But what is strange about it is the implication that something which appears to be intellectual and abstract, finding God, is connected with such concrete images in specific times and places. That is a long way down memory lane, nearly 80 years down, and yet the memory of it is quite intense. I can't think about my spirituality without referring to it. From my faith life, now let me move on to another genre in these personal narrative that I might refer to as my love life. Page 57. The title is The End of Faithfulness, Comedy, Tragedy, or Grace. Early I vowed faithfulness and held it between me and my God, until it was claimed in part by Jane. In the noon of my days, when my libido ran full flood, it was my pride that somehow it held with that Jane too. But in the back of my mind, there lurked a fear that somehow with time my pride would break and my libido would carry me off to that comic fate of a mocked and hampered Falstaff. Or else my libido would break and, left to my pride, I would rail against my offspring and come to that tragic fate of a reviled and outcast Lear. Now, on the edge of the dark, it would appear that by some stroke of luck, both broke in the same day. And in my end, I am left with faithfulness and pondering the conundrum that my life has accomplished neither great comedy nor high tragedy. Indeed, nothing more than grace. Thank God. Of course, Faith life and love life are inherently entwined. Each would suffer from any attempt to compartmentalize. With the next poem, I'll return to my faith life, and it strikes a note of declaration or resignation about how it ends. The title of it is I Will Die in a Little Church. It's on page 73. It is now clear that I will die in a small church. I'd once thought that it might be in some great church. I wrote in a book when I was 17, 5 years after I discovered God in a small church. I'm not satisfied by it or any other form of religious establishment. I can't say that I know what the boy was thinking when he wrote that. I do know that later he had aspirations for a great church, which led him, after serving for 7 years, 2 small churches as vicars, both of whom he loved, and even now can recall them by name: Hap Conley, Dutch Schultz, Bill and Betty McKibben, Pinder, Palmer. I mean, he could pretty much name them all. And sometimes he wakes up at night and finds himself doing so. He went to the Dominican Study House, located in the Great Priory of St. Rose of Lima, and Dubuque on the banks of the Mississippi. It was a large foundation, never fulfilling the grandeur that it imagined for itself. At the time, it was seeking an alternative grandeur by offering, with Lutherans of Wartburg and the Calvinists of Dubuque Seminary, degrees in ecumenical theology, envisioning a truly great church. He was sure that there he was writing theology for his little church that would be so embracing that it could be ignored only by the most intransient, and drawing all into some great church. He imagined he would die in communion with Rome, at peace with Geneva, in agreement with Concordia. But in the pressures of the 80s, ecumenism was sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Leadership responded to the crisis in their communities, not with a call for faith, apparently not remembering that their Lord had promised to be with 2 or 3, but trusting the invincible power of fear, which promised to provide a fierce hold on people and a ready explanation for any disaffections. To the great church never happened. On leaving studies, he went to work in a large urban parish that aspired to assemble a great crowd. With them, he practiced ecumenism, lived theology, and experienced some great crowds, or so it seemed. But now the ecumenism is gone, so too is the great crowd. So as the night comes, that is I, am resigned to dying in a small church, now free from the distinction between great and small, and I have no doubt that in a small church, God will find me. This raises the issues of one's dying. While at my age it might seem understandable to have thoughts on this topic, the fact is that at any age those thoughts are there, and resisting imagining it comes with a cost. The more one escapes imagining it, the more the journey of life turns into a flight. This causes one's narrative to evolve into fantasy and myth. Not, of course, is there any need to rush. Here is a poem out of my love life, Love of Nature. In this case, which registers with those sentiments of not being in a big rush. It happened while I was sitting one November afternoon, late in the afternoon, on the deck behind our house. Its title in the mood to hold on, page 58. The sun itself has slipped beneath the horizon in the west. Still it sends its light high up over the tops of trees, which tower over my head, where it paints autumnal gold and red on limbs chilled and bared, and I'm in the mood to hold on so long as it is there. And I think that by doing so, I'm shortening the coming dark that will separate this moment from when it will rise red in the east. Well, let me conclude with one more final poem that also has to do with the love of nature in a certain sense, and also has to do with preparing for one's life after death. I've just driven up from my home in Omaha to see my brother and his wife who live in western Iowa. With a sunlit afternoon, February afternoon, the hills are all gold and it allowed me to resample those hills that roll in gentle folds. It was really quite lovely. This poem is found on page 80 and is entitled Tossed Up on a Far Shore of Eternity. I was born where the dirt is black and sweet, and the hills roll in gentle folds before the steady eye. It is in them that my youthful formation lie. But like some Israelite, I went down to the sea in ships and was troubled and tossed about, and in due time was cast up and out. In the end, I went back to the dirt which is black and sweet, and the hills that roll in gentle folds before the eye, and it is there it now appears that I shall die. But I am glad for having gone to the sea, down to the sea in ships, for in the end it seems to me we shall all be put out to sea. So I think I'm better prepared to go down to eternity, and no matter how black or troubled that sea, no matter how lost and staggered I be, I shall be glad to have known both the dirt and the sea, for having received my life from the one and gained my legs from the other. When I am taken and tossed by a sudden wave, bent on bearing me to that distant shore of eternity, I shall call them all sweet, sweet dirt, sweet sea. Well, thank you for listening this evening. First Thursday will return on March 2nd, which will be Maundy Thursday. That celebration in the course of Holy Week that remembers the founding of the Last Supper. It'll provide a good opportunity to look at poems and aphorisms from On Giving My Word that relate to communion and Holy Eucharist.